In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a gunshot shatters the night, and architect Cedric Hawthorne is found dead in his studio, a blood-stained blueprint beneath him. Was it his elegant wife, hiding a broken heart? His ambitious assistant, yearning to escape his shadow? The wealthy client, furious over delays? Or the jovial contractor, desperate to bury a dangerous secret? Enter Miss Jane Marple, whose gentle demeanor and sharp eyes unravel a web of ambition, betrayal, and greed. In a village where secrets linger like mist, one truth will emerge, but at what cost? Dive into The Shot Architect, where every clue is a step closer to a killer. Chapter 1. The studio in the stormed wind howled through the narrow lanes of St. Mary Mead, driving sheets of rain against the windows of Cedric Hawthorne's architectural studio. The studio, a converted barn perched on a hillock overlooking the village, stood resolute against the storm, its timber beams creaking like the bones of an old ship. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of cedar shavings and the sharp tang of ink, a testament to the meticulous work of its occupant. Cedric Hawthorne, a man whose angular features mirrored the bold lines of his designs, lay slumped over his drafting table, a single bullet wound in his chest. His lifeless hands still clutched a pencil, as if death had caught him mid-sketch. The blueprint beneath him, smeared with blood, depicted the skeletal frame of a grand manor, its edges curling in the damp air. The discovery of the body had sent a ripple through the village. Though the news reached Miss Jane Marple, not through official channels, but via the intricate web of St. Mary Mead's gossip. It was Mrs. Bantry, the postmistress, who first relayed the tale over a cup of Darjeeling. At 4 o'clock, found this morning, Miss Marple by young Tom, his assistant. Quite dreadful. The police are there now, cordoning off the place. Her voice trembled with the thrill of scandal, her eyes bright with the privilege of being the first to tell. Miss Marple, seated in her chintz armchair, her knitting needles poised over a half-finished shawl, listened with her customary quiet attention. Her delicate fingers, though slowed by age, moved with precision, each stitch a silent counterpoint to the postmistress's breathless narrative. A shooting, you say? Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost absent, as if her mind were already sifting through possibilities. In St. Mary Mead, of all places. How very curious. Her blue eyes, deceptively mild, flickered with interest. Murder was not unknown in the village. Human nature, as she often remarked to her nephew Raymond, was much the same whether in London or a country lane, but a shooting carried a certain audacity, a deliberate flourish that suggested more than a passing impulse. She set her knitting aside and adjusted her lace cap, her thoughts turning to Cedric Hawthorne, whom she had met only once, at a village fete. He had struck her as a man of intensity, his dark eyes burning with a vision that outstripped the modest confines of St. Mary Mead. His designs, she recalled, were the talk of the county, though not always for their beauty. Some whispered of arrogance, others of brilliance. Both, Miss Marple knew, could breed enemies. Mrs. Bantry, eager to share more, leaned forward, her teacup forgotten. They say it was no accident, Miss Marple, a revolver, left on the floor, plain as day, and the studio door was locked from the inside, or so the milkman heard from Constable Reed. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unperturbed. Locked doors and revolvers were the stuff of mystery novels. But life, she had found, was often more theatrical than fiction. She recalled the studio's isolation, set apart from the village by a winding path lined with hawthorn hedges. It was a place where secrets could fester, undisturbed by prying eyes. And who, she asked, her tone gentle, was in the village last night? It was a wild evening to be out. Mrs. Bantry's brow furrowed. Well, there's Eleanor, his wife, of course. She keeps to herself, always so elegant, but cold, don't you think? And Tom, the assistant, was seen leaving the studio late. Then there's Mr. Grayson, that landowner who's building the new manor. He's a temper, That one. And Mr. Burrows, the contractor, was at the Blue Boar till closing, or so I heard. She paused, then added, "It's a queer business, Miss Marple." Cedric wasn't the sort to make friends easily. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind already tracing the outlines of the suspects, like a sketch taking form on a blank page. Eleanor Hawthorne, with her poised reserve, reminded her of Mrs. Elspeth from Mead, who had hidden a bitter heart behind a polished smile. Tom, the assistant, might be like young Peter from the choir, all ambition and impatience, chafing under a master's shadow. Mr. Grayson, the client, sounded like Colonel Bantry's old friend, Major Hargreaves, whose bluster masked a ruthless streak. And Mr. Burrows, the contractor, well, Miss Marple had known men like him in St. Mary Mead, men whose joviality was a mask for sharper dealings. A queer business indeed, she murmured, her needles resuming their rhythm. "I think, Mrs. Bantry, I shall take a walk tomorrow, storm or no storm. Fresh air does wonders for the mind." As the postmistress bustled off to spread the news further, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the rain streak the glass. The studio in the storm, she thought, was more than a crime scene. It was a stage, and the players were already taking their places. She tied off a stitch and reached for her tea, her thoughts as sharp as the pencil that had fallen from Cedric Hawthorne's hand. The truth, she knew, lay not in the bullet or the locked door, but in the hearts of those who had stood in that studio's shadow. Chapter 2. The Gathering of Shadows. The storm had abated by morning, leaving St. Mary Mead draped in a damp, silvery mist that clung to the cobblestones and curled around the chimneys. The village, usually a picture of pastoral calm, buzzed with a subdued excitement, as if the very air had caught wind of the tragedy at Cedric Hawthorne's studio. By noon, the police had cordoned off the converted barn, its slate roof glistening under a weak sun. Inspector Craddock, a man whose square jaw and steady gaze belied a mind often taxed by the complexities of human motive, had summoned the 4 individuals closest to the late architect to the scene of the crime. It was an unusual step, but Craddock, who had learned to value the quiet insights of a certain elderly spinster, had extended an invitation to Miss Jane Marple to attend as a consulting observer. Though he would never admit it aloud, her presence had a way of clarifying the murkier corners of a case. Miss Marple arrived at the studio promptly at 1 o'clock, her black umbrella folded neatly under her arm, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. The air was sharp with the scent of wet earth and pine, and she paused to survey the scene. The studio stood apart from the village, its isolation both its charm and, she suspected, its vulnerability. The tall windows, now streaked with rain, reflected the gray sky, and the heavy oak door bore the marks of police boots. Inside, the space was cavernous, with exposed beams and a high ceiling that amplified every sound. Cedric's drafting table dominated the center, its surface still stained with the dark bloom of his blood, though the body had been removed. Blueprints were pinned to the walls, their precise lines a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Inspector Craddock greeted her with a nod, his expression a mixture of respect and mild exasperation. "Miss Marple, I trust you're well. I'm not sure what you'll make of this lot, but I'd value your impressions." His voice carried the weight of a man who had spent the morning wrangling contradictory statements and fraying tempers. Miss Marple smiled, her blue eyes bright behind her spectacles. "I'm sure you have everything well in hand, Inspector," she said, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. "But I do find that observing people in their moments of discomfort can be most revealing." She took a seat in a corner, near a shelf of architectural journals, her knitting bag at her side. From this vantage point, she could see the entire room without drawing attention a position she had found most conducive to understanding. The suspects were ushered in one by one, each entering with a distinct air that Miss Marple noted with the precision of a botanist cataloging rare specimens. First came Eleanor Hawthorne, the architect's widow, her elegance undiminished by grief. She was tall and slender, her dark hair swept into a chignon that spoke of careful composure. Her dress, a deep gray silk, was immaculate, but her eyes, red-rimmed and shadowed, betrayed a sleepless night. She moved with the grace of a dancer, yet there was a brittleness to her, as if a single misstep might shatter her poise. She stood near the window, her hands clasped tightly, avoiding the drafting table as if it were a living thing. Next was Tom Eldridge, Cedric's assistant, a young man of perhaps 25, with a shock of sandy hair and a nervous energy that seemed to hum beneath his skin. His suit was slightly rumpled, as if he had dressed in haste, and his fingers toyed incessantly with a pencil he had plucked from his pocket. He glanced at the drafting table, then away, his jaw tightening. Miss Marple noted the faint ink stains on his cuffs, a sign of long hours spent copying Cedric's designs. There was something of the eager puppy in Tom, she thought, but puppies, when cornered, could bite. Mr. Arthur Grayson followed, his presence filling the room like a gust of wind. A landowner of considerable wealth, he was a man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered and ruddy-faced, with a mane of silver hair that gave him the air of a lion. His tailored coat and polished boots spoke of money, but his scowl suggested a temper barely held in check. He leaned heavily on a mahogany cane, its silver handle gleaming in the dim light. "This is a damned inconvenience," he muttered, loud enough for all to hear. "I've business to attend to, Craddock. Let's get on with it." His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to command, but Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the cane. It was heavy, she noted, and curiously ornate for a practical accessory. Last to enter was Mr. Harold Burroughs, the contractor, a burly man whose jovial demeanor seemed at odds with the occasion. His florid face was creased with a smile, and he clapped his hands together as if arriving at a friendly gathering. "Terrible business, Inspector. Just terrible," he said, his voice booming. Cedric was a fine man, a visionary. Who'd do such a thing? His eyes, however, darted about the room, lingering on the blueprints pinned to the walls. Miss Marple observed the calluses on his hands, the slight sheen of sweat on his brow, despite the chill. He reminded her of Mr. Hoskins, the butcher from her youth, whose hearty laugh had masked a penchant for short-changing customers. Craddock cleared his throat, standing by the drafting table with a notebook in hand. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his tone measured. "As you know, Mr. Cedric Hawthorne was found dead here last night, shot through the heart. The revolver was recovered nearby, and the door was locked from the inside, suggesting the killer was someone familiar with this place. I'll need your accounts of where you were between 6 and 9 o'clock yesterday evening." His eyes scanned the group, and Miss Marple noted the subtle shifts in posture. Eleanor's shoulders stiffened. Tom's pencil snapped in his hand. Grayson's cane tapped the floor, and Boros's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Eleanor spoke first, her voice low but clear. "I was at home, Inspector. I had a headache and retired early. Cedric. He often worked late, so I didn't expect him until after 9. Her words were precise, but Miss Marple caught the slight hesitation before headache, as if the word had been chosen with care. She thought of Mrs. Langley, a neighbor from years past, whose headaches had coincided with her husband's late nights at the club. Excuses, Miss Marple knew, could be as revealing as confessions. Tom was. Next, his voice unsteady. "I was here until about 7, maybe 7:30. Cedric asked me to fetch some old blueprints from the archive. I left him working, same as always." He glanced at the drafting table, then quickly away, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I went straight home after. I live above the bakery, and Mrs. Tuttle can vouch for me." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap. Tom's account was plausible, but his nervousness suggested something unspoken. She recalled young Tommy Pierce, who had stammered just so when caught pilfering apples, not because he feared punishment, but because he feared discovery of a larger secret. Grayson's response was curt. I was at my estate, dining with my steward. We discussed the manor project. Hawthorne's delays were costing me a fortune. I was there all evening, and my staff will confirm it. His tone dared contradiction, but Miss Marple noted the way his hand tightened on his cane. Men, like Grayson, she thought, were not accustomed to being questioned, and their pride could make them careless. She made a mental note to inquire about the steward's loyalty. Servants, she had found, often saw more than their masters realized. Burroughs spread his hands, his smile returning. I was at the Blue Boar, Inspector, having a pint with some lads from the crew. We were there till closing, around 10. Plenty of folk saw me. His voice was warm, almost convivial, but Miss Marple's eyes lingered on his boots. They were caked with mud, the kind that clung to the fields near the studio, not the cobblestones of the village square. She thought of Mr. Jenkins, the grocer, whose cheerful demeanor had hidden a penchant for smuggling. Cheer, she knew, could be a mask as effective as silence. Craddock jotted notes, his brow furrowed. The revolver, he said, producing a photograph of the weapon, was a Webley Standard issue, no serial number filed off. Does anyone recognize it? He passed the photograph among them, and Miss Marple watched their reactions closely. Eleanor's face remained impassive, her hands steady. Tom flinched slightly, as if the image startled him. Grayson snorted, dismissing it with a wave. Burroughs, however, lingered on the photograph, his fingers brushing the edge before he handed it back. Never seen it, he said, but his voice had lost its earlier warmth. Miss Marple's needles paused. A man who lingered, she thought, often, had more to say. The inspector moved on to the locked door, a detail that seemed to perplex him. The key was found in Cedric's pocket, and there's no sign of forced entry, he said. Whoever did this either had a key or was let in by Mr. Hawthorne himself. The implication hung in the air. The killer was no stranger. Ellie's lips parted, as if to speak, but she closed them again. Tom shifted his weight, his broken pencil now a stub in his hand. Grayson muttered something about damned theatrics, while Burroughs nodded solemnly, as if the fact were merely unfortunate. Miss Marple's mind turned to the studio's layout, which she had glimpsed on her arrival. There was a back entrance, half hidden by a stack of lumber, that led to the fields. She resolved to mention it to Craddock later, in private. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple's attention wandered to the studio itself. The walls were lined with Cedric's work, sketches of soaring arches, plans for glass-walled pavilions, and the intricate blueprints for Grayson's manor, its foundation drawn with obsessive detail. She noted a small desk in the corner, cluttered, with papers and a half-empty bottle of ink. A photograph rested there, showing Cedric and Eleanor at a garden party, their smiles strained. Beside it was a sketchbook, its pages dog-eared. Miss Marple made a mental note to ask Craddock to examine it. Small things she had learned often held the largest truths. The session drew to a close, and Craddock dismissed the suspects with a warning to remain in the village. As they filed out, Miss Marple remained, her knitting a soft rhythm in the quiet. Craddock approached, rubbing his temple. A tricky lot, he said. No one's story breaks, but no one's quite convincing either. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the drafting table. People, Inspector, are rarely what they seem at first glance. It's the small inconsistencies, the snapped pencil, the muddy boots that tell the story. Craddock raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He had learned, over time, to trust her instincts, however cryptic they seemed, as she stepped into the mist. Miss Marple glanced back at the studio, its windows dark against the fading light. The gathering of shadows, she thought, was not just the suspects, but the secrets they carried. Eleanor's composure, Tom's nerves, Grayson's bluster. Burroughs's cheerage was a thread in a tapestry, yet to be woven. She tightened her shawl and began the walk back to her cottage, her mind already sorting the threads. The storm had passed, but another was brewing, and Miss Marple knew that truth, like rain, would eventually fall. Chapter 3. The Architect's Legacy. The morning sun broke through the mist, casting a golden sheen over St. Mary Mead's thatched roofs and dukest gardens. Miss Jane Marple sat in her small parlor, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm, though her mind was far from the scarf taking shape in her lap. The murder of Cedric Hawthorne had stirred the village like a stone dropped in a still pond, and the ripples were spreading. By mid-morning, she had received a visit from Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, whose knack for gathering gossip rivaled Miss Marple's own talent for unraveling it. Over a pot of Earl Grey, Mrs. Price's words poured forth, each detail a potential thread in the tapestry of the case. Cedric Hawthorne was a genius. Miss Marple, no doubt about it, Mrs. Price began, her hands fluttering as she poured tea. Those designs of his, why, they're in magazines. But he wasn't an easy man, always pushing, always demanding. They say he clashed with everyone on that manor project. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. I heard from Mrs. Tuttle at the bakery that he and Mr. Burrows had a dreadful row last week, right in the village square. Something about shoddy work, and Mr. Grayson, the client, was furious about delays. Threatened to pull his funding. He did. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of polite interest, though her mind was cataloguing every word. And Mrs. Hawthorne? She asked, her tone mild. How did she bear it, with all this tension around her husband? Mrs. Price leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. Eleanor. Oh, she's a proper lady, always so composed. But I saw her myself, arguing with Cedric outside the post office not 2 days ago. She said something about betrayal. I couldn't catch it all, but her face was white as chalk, and then she stormed off, leaving him standing there like a man who'd lost his bearings. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. Betrayal, she thought, was a word that carried weight. It could mean many things, a broken vow, a professional slight, or something darker. She recalled Mrs. Clement, the vicar's sister, who had once spoken of betrayal when her fiancé had gambled away their savings. Eleanor's anger, like Mrs. Clement's, might point to a wound deeper than village gossip could fathom. And young Tom, the assistant, Miss Marple prompted. He must have felt the strain, working so closely with such a demanding man. Mrs. Price's lips pursed. Tom Eldridge is a nice lad, but ambitious, you know. Always sketching, always talking about his own designs. I heard him tell Mrs. Tuttle he'd never get a chance while Cedric was around. Said Cedric treated him like a clerk, not an architect. Mind you, he's clever. Mrs. Bantry says he's been sending drawings to a firm in London, hoping for a break. Miss Marple's eyes brightened imperceptibly. Ambition, she knew, was a fire that could warm a career or burn a life to ashes. She thought of young Mr. Harmon, who had once sabotaged a rival's garden to win the village flower show. Tom's dreams, if thwarted, might have turned his loyalty into something sharper. She set her teacup down, her mind turning to Cedric himself. Tell me, Mrs. Price, she said, what was Mr. Hawthorne like? Beyond his work, I mean. Mrs. Price hesitated, as if weighing her words. He was intense. Charming when he wanted to be, but sharp-tongued when crossed. He'd come to the vicarage for tea, now and then, always talking about his vision buildings that would outlast us all. But he had a way of making people feel small. Even the vicar said he felt like a schoolboy when Cedric got going. And there were rumors. She trailed off, glancing at Miss Marple, as if unsure whether to continue. Rumors. Miss Marple's voice was encouraging, her face a mask of gentle curiosity. Well, Mrs. Price said, lowering her voice, some say Cedric had interests outside his marriage. A lady in town, perhaps, or late nights at the studio that weren't all about work. Nothing proven, mind you, but Mrs. Bantry heard from her maid that Eleanor was seen crying at the church gate last month. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment, then resumed. Infidelity, if true, could explain Eleanor's betrayal and add a layer to her grief. She thought of Mrs. Hargreaves, a widow from her youth, whose husband's wanderings had left her silent but vengeful. Eleanor's composure, Miss Marple mused, might hide a similar storm. "Thank you, Mrs. Price," she said, smiling. "You've been most helpful. I think I shall take a stroll to the studio this afternoon. The air will do me good." Mrs. Price bustled off, eager to share her news with the next listener, and Miss Marple prepared for her walk. She donned her tweed coat and a hat adorned with a single feather, her umbrella at the ready in case the weather turned. The path to the studio wound through fields dotted with grazing sheep, their woolly forms blending with the mist that still lingered in the hollows. As she walked, she reflected on Cedric Hawthorne's legacy. His designs, as Mrs. Price had said, were celebrated, but they were also bold to the point of recklessness. The manor from Mr. Grayson, with its cantilevered terraces and vast glass walls, was a gamble in a county fond of tradition. Such ambition, she knew, often came at a cost. When she reached the studio, the police tape had been removed, though Constable Reed stood guard at the door. He tipped his hat, recognizing her from past cases. "Inspector Craddock's inside, Miss Marple," he said. "You might come by." She smiled and stepped into the barn, where the air was cooler, tinged with the faint, metallic scent of blood. Craddock was examining a stack of blueprints, his brow furrowed. "Miss Marple," he said, looking up, "I'm trying to make sense of these. Hawthorne was obsessive about his work, every line perfect. But there's something odd here." He gestured to a blueprint of the manor's foundation, its margins crowded with Cedric's spidery handwriting. Miss Marple peered at it, her spectacles catching the light. "Notes about materials," she observed, "and corrections, perhaps." The word beams was underlined, with a question mark beside it. Craddock nodded. "Looks like he was worried about the construction. There's a note about substandard timber and a name Burroughs." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Mr. Burroughs, the contractor." Mrs. Price mentioned a quarrel between him and Mr. Hawthorne. Something about shoddy work. She straightened, her eyes scanning the room. The drafting table, now cleaned of blood, bore faint scratches, as if Cedric had gripped it tightly in his final moments. Nearby, a shelf held models of his designs, miniature spires and arches, each a testament to his vision. But vision, she thought, could blind a man to danger. Craddock sighed. "Burroughs claims he was at the Blue Boar all evening, and half the village backs him up. But these notes, they suggest Hawthorne was onto something. If Burroughs was cutting corners, it could ruin him." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the contractor's jovial demeanor at the studio yesterday. She recalled Mr. Ellison, a builder from her childhood, who had smiled through accusations of faulty wiring until a fire exposed his negligence. Men like Burroughs, she thought, often hid their fears behind a hardy facade. She wandered to the small desk in the corner, where the photograph of Cedric and Eleanor still stood. The image captured a moment of apparent harmony, but Miss Marple noted the distance between them, their hands not touching. Beside it was the sketchbook she had noticed before, its pages filled with quick, expressive drawings, some of buildings, others of faces, including one that resembled Tom Eldridge, his expression somber. "Did Mr. Hawthorne keep a diary, Inspector?" she asked, her voice casual. Craddock shook his head. "Not that we've found. Just these sketches and notes." "Why?" "Oh, nothing," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "Only, people often reveal themselves in what they choose to draw." She made a mental note to ask Tom about the sketchbook. A young man's loyalty, she knew, could fray under the weight of unacknowledged talent. She thought of Mr. Price's nephew, who had once forged a letter to escape his uncle's shadow. Ambition, again, was a thread worth following, as they left the studio. Craddock locked the door, and Miss Marple glanced at the back entrance, half hidden by lumber. "Have you checked this door, Inspector?" she asked. He nodded. "Locked like the front. No signs of tampering." She said nothing, but her eyes lingered on the system, the path nearby. Miss Marple asked, her voice as soft as ever. Craddock nodded, his expression one of mild surprise at the question. "The back door. Yes, it was locked, same as the front. No signs of forced entry, though we're still checking for any spare keys that might have been used." "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with that familiar glint of quiet curiosity. "Oh, just a thought, Inspector. Paths less trodden can sometimes lead to unexpected places." She didn't press further, but her mind was already turning over the possibilities. A locked back door, half hidden by lumber, suggested a route. Less obvious than the front entrance, a route someone familiar with the studio might know well. She made a mental note to ask Constable Reed about any footprints in the muddy field beyond, though she suspected the rain might have washed such clues away as they stepped back into the damp air. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Cedric Hawthorne's legacy. His work was more than lines on paper. It was a battleground of ambition, pride, and compromise. The Mana Project, with its grand design and troubled execution, was a microcosm of the man himself, brilliant, flawed, and surrounded by those who stood to gain or lose by his vision. Eleanor's betrayal, Tom's ambition, Grayson's impatience, Boros's corner-cutting itch, was a piece of a puzzle that had ended in a bullet. Miss Marple tightened her shawl against the chill, her needles still in her bag, waiting for the moment when the pattern of this crime would come clear. For now, she walked back toward St. Mary Mead, her mind weaving threads that would, in time, form a tapestry of truth. Chapter 4. The assistant's ambition. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where she sat, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock. The village of St. Mary Mead had settled into a wary calm, the initial shock of Cedric Hawthorne's murder giving way to a hum of speculation that buzzed like bees in a summer garden. Miss Marple, however, was not one for idle chatter. Her mind, sharp as the needles in her hands, was fixed on Tom Eldridge, the young assistant whose nervous demeanor at the studio had caught her attention. There was something in his restless energy, she thought, that reminded her of a bird beating its wings against a cage eager to fly, but trapped by circumstance. She had learned from Mrs. Bantry, who had called earlier with a basket of scones and a wealth of gossip, that Tom was not just Cedric's assistant, but a budding architect in his own right. "He's got talent, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bantry had said, her eyes wide with the thrill of sharing news. "Draws like an angel, they say, but Cedric kept him on a tight leash, copying plans, running errands, never letting him shine. Mrs. Tuttle at the bakery told me Tom sent some sketches to a London firm, hoping for a commission. Imagine, our own St. Mary Mead boy in the city." Miss Marple had nodded, her needles clicking, and filed the information away. Ambition, she knew, could be a gentle dream or a consuming fire, and Tom's fidgeting hands suggested the latter. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to the bakery, where Tom lodged in a small room above the shop. The walk was pleasant, the air crisp with the scent of damp leaves and freshly turned earth. The bakery, a squat building with a cheerful red awning, was bustling with villagers buying their daily bread, and Mrs. Tuttle, a stout woman with flour-dusted hands, greeted Miss Marple warmly. "Oh, Miss Marple, what a dreadful business with Mr. Hawthorne. Poor Tom's been ever so quiet since it happened. He's upstairs now, if you'd like to see him." Miss Marple thanked her and climbed the narrow staircase, her steps slow but steady. The room at the top was modest, with a slanted ceiling and a single window overlooking the village green. Tom was seated at a small desk, his head bent over a sketchbook, his pencil moving with quick, precise strokes. He looked up as Miss Marple knocked gently on the open door, his expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect you." His voice was polite, but his eyes darted to the sketchbook, which he closed with a quick motion. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Mr. Eldridge," Miss Marple said, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "I was passing by and thought I'd see how you're faring after such a shock." She took a seat on a rickety chair, her knitting bag resting on her lap. The room was tidy but sparse, with a few architectural books stacked on a shelf and a pile of blueprints in the corner. A single drawing, pinned to the wall, caught her eye: a graceful pavilion with curved lines, unlike Cedric's angular style. "What a lovely sketch," she remarked, nodding toward it. "Yours, I presume?" Tom flushed, a mix of pride and discomfort crossing his face. "Yes, ma'am. Just something I've been working on. Nothing like Mr. Hawthorne's designs, of course." His words were deferential, but Miss Marple caught the faint edge of bitterness, like a sour note in a melody. She thought of young Mr. Carter, a gardener's boy from her youth, who had resented his master's praise while craving his approval. Ambition, she mused, often danced with resentment. "I'm sure your work is quite fine," she said, her eyes gentle but probing. "It must have been difficult, working under such a particular man as Mr. Hawthorne. I understand he was very exacting." She watched Tom closely, noting the way his fingers tightened on the pencil he still held. "He was," Tom admitted, his voice low. "Cedric, Mr. Hawthorne wanted everything perfect. Every line, every angle. I spent hours copying his plans, checking measurements, while he stopped, as if catching himself, and forced a smile. He was a genius, really. I learned a lot." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "It's a rare thing to learn from a master, but it can be trying, too, when one's own ideas are set aside." She paused, her gaze resting on the closed sketchbook. "I heard you've sent some designs to London." "That's very enterprising." Tom's eyes widened, a flicker of alarm crossing his face. "Who told you that?" "I mean, yes, I did. Just a few sketches, nothing serious. I thought, well, maybe I could get a start somewhere else." His words tumbled out, and Miss Marple noted the flush creeping up his neck. She thought of Miss Emily, a seamstress who had once hidden her dreams of dressmaking under her employer's shadow, only to strike out in desperation. Tom's ambition, she suspected, was a similar spark, waiting for a gust to ignite it. "That's a fine ambition," she said, her voice warm. "But it must have been hard, with Mr. Hawthorne so busy with the Manor project." "I hear there were troubles, delays, disagreements. Did he ever speak of them?" She kept her tone light, as if merely curious, but her eyes missed nothing. Tom hesitated, his fingers snapping the pencil in two with a sharp crack. "He mentioned things. The Manor was a big job, and Mr. Grayson was always pushing for it to be done faster. And Mr. Burrowswell, Cedric thought he wasn't doing the work properly, said the materials weren't up to standard. They argued about it more than once." He looked down at the broken pencil, as if surprised by his own strength. "But I stayed out of it. I just did my job, of course," Miss Marple said, her smile encouraging. "And that evening, when you left the studio around 7, was it? You went straight home?" Her question was gentle, but she watched his reaction closely, noting the way his shoulders stiffened. 7:30, I think," he said, his voice a shade too quick. "I fetched some blueprints for Cedric, then came back here. Mrs. Tuttle saw me come in." He met her gaze, but his eyes flickered, as if searching for something to anchor his story. Miss Marple thought of young Tommy Pierce again, whose lies about stolen apples had crumbled under a kind but steady gaze. Tom's story held, but it was frayed at the edges. They spoke for a few minutes more, Miss Marple steering the conversation to lighter topics: the weather, the village fete before rising to leave. "You've been most kind, Mr. Eldridge," she said, adjusting her hat. "I do hope you'll find success with your designs. Talent like yours deserves a chance to shine." Tom murmured a thank you, but his expression remained guarded, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy. Ambition, she knew, could be a lonely path, as she descended the stairs. Mrs. Tuttle bustled over, wiping her hands on her apron. "Did you get what you needed, Miss Marple?" "Poor lad's been so quiet, not himself at all." Miss Marple smiled, her mind already turning over Tom's words. "He's bearing up," she said. "But grief takes people in different ways." She stepped into the street, where the afternoon was fading into a soft dusk, the village lamps just beginning to glow. On her way home, Miss Marple stopped by the Blue Boar Inn, where the barmaid, a cheerful girl named Lily, was polishing glasses. Lily, who had a knack for overhearing conversations, confirmed Tom's presence at the bakery that evening, but added a detail that made Miss Marple pause. "He came in around 8, I think, but he was all flustered, like he'd been running. And he had mud on his shoes, Miss Marple, though it was raining something fierce." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind sharpening on the image of muddy shoes. The studio's back path, she recalled, was a quagmire after the storm. If Tom had been there later than he claimed, his story was not as tidy as it seemed, back in her cottage. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts elsewhere. Tom Eldridge was a young man with dreams larger than St. Mary. Mead, dreams that Cedric's shadow might have darkened. His nervousness, his broken pencil, his muddy shoes all were threads in a pattern that was beginning to take shape. She thought of Mr. Harmon again, whose ambition had led him to sabotage, and wondered if Tom's had led him further. Ambition, she mused, could push a man to great heights or to a desperate act. As the fire crackled, she tied off a stitch, her mind weaving the next steps in her quiet pursuit of the truth. Chapter 5. The Wife's Silence. The soft glow of morning light filtered through the rose-trellised windows of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting dappled shadows on the chintz upholstery. Outside, St. Mary Mead was stirring, the clatter of milk, bottles and the chatter of early risers blending into a familiar symphony. Miss Marple, seated at her breakfast table, with a cup of tea and her ever-present knitting, was deep in thought. The murder of Cedric Hawthorne lingered in her mind like an unfinished melody, and today her attention was fixed on Eleanor Hawthorne, the widow whose poised exterior seemed to conceal a deeper turmoil. Mrs. Price's mention of betrayal, and the village whispers of Cedric's wandering eye had piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. Grief, she knew, could mask many things: sorrow, anger, or even guilt. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple decided to call on Eleanor under the guise of offering condolences. She donned her best wool coat, pinned her hat with care, and set out for the Hawthorne residence, a handsome Georgian house on the edge of the village, its ivy-clad walls giving it an air of quiet dignity. The walk was brisk, the autumn air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves, and Miss Marple's steps were purposeful, her umbrella tapping the pavement like a metronome. As she approached the house, she noted the drawn curtains and the untouched post in the letterbox, a sign, perhaps, of a household paused in mourning. Eleanor herself answered the door, her appearance as immaculate as ever. Her dark hair was swept back, her gray dress simple yet elegant, but her face was pale, the lines around her eyes etched deeper than Miss Marple remembered. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but steady, "how kind of you to come." She stepped aside, gesturing toward the drawing room. "Please, come in. Would you like tea?" "That would be lovely," Miss Marple replied, her smile warm but observant. The drawing room was tastefully furnished, with polished mahogany and delicate porcelain, but it felt cold, as if the fire in the grate had been lit more for form than warmth. On a side table stood a photograph of Cedric, his intense gaze captured in black and white, and beside it, a vase of wilting roses. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on these details as she took a seat, her knitting bag at her side. Small things, she thought, often spoke louder than words. Eleanor moved with practiced grace, pouring tea from a silver pot, but her hands trembled slightly, betraying a tension beneath her composure. "It's been a difficult time," she said, handing Miss Marple a cup. "Cedric's death. It's so sudden. I still can't quite believe it." Her voice was measured, but there was a brittleness to it, like porcelain on the verge of cracking. "I can only imagine," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "Such a loss, and so unexpected. You must have been very proud of his work." She sipped her tea, watching Eleanor over the rim of her cup. The widow's fingers tightened around her own cup, a faint clink of china betraying her unease. "He was brilliant," Eleanor said, her eyes fixed on the fire. "His designs were his life. The manor for Mr. Grayson, the pavilions he planned. For the county they were all he talked about. Sometimes I think he loved them more than—" She stopped, her lips pressing into a thin line, and Miss Marple noted the unfinished sentence. It reminded her of Mrs. Langley, whose silences had hidden a marriage strained by neglect, more than other things. "Perhaps," Miss Marple finished softly, her voice inviting confidence. "It must have been lonely at times, with him so devoted to his work." She paused, her needles clicking as she began a new row. "I heard you and he had a disagreement recently, in the village. It's so easy for small misunderstandings to grow in times of stress." Eleanor's eyes flicked to Miss Marple, a flash of wariness crossing her face before she smoothed it away. "You've heard the gossip, then," she said, her voice cool. "Yes, we argued. Cedric was difficult. He could be so absorbed, so dismissive. But it was nothing serious, just the usual tensions of marriage." She set her cup down, her movements deliberate. "I loved him, Miss Marple. Whatever people say, I loved him, of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "Love is a complex thing, isn't it? It holds us together, even when it hurts." She thought of Mrs. Hargreaves, whose love for her unfaithful husband had turned to quiet rage, expressed not in shouts but in calculated acts. Eleanor's composure, she suspected, might conceal a similar storm. "That evening," she continued, "when Cedric was at the studio, you were here, I understand?" Eleanor nodded, her gaze returning to the fire. "Yes, I was here. I had a headache and went to bed early. Cedric often worked late, so I didn't expect him home. I wish I'd gone to him, perhaps." Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the way her hands clenched in her lap, the knuckles white. "There's no use in what-ifs, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "But it must be hard, being alone that night, with no one to confirm your presence." Her words were gentle, but they hung in the air, a quiet invitation to reveal more. Eleanor's lips parted, as if to protest, then closed again. "I was alone," she said simply. "There's nothing more to say." But Miss Marple saw the flicker of something fear, perhaps, or guilt in her eyes. She thought of Miss Emily, whose silence about a stolen brooch had hidden not theft but shame. Eleanor's reticence, she sensed, was a shield for something unspoken. As they spoke, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the room's details. A half-packed suitcase stood in the corner, its contents neatly folded but not yet closed. A coat hung on a rack, its hem damp, as if recently worn in the rain. On the mantel, a clock ticked unevenly, its rhythm slightly off, much like Eleanor's story. "You're planning a trip?" Miss Marple asked, nodding toward the suitcase, her tone casual. Eleanor followed her gaze, a flush creeping up her neck. "Oh, that. I thought I might visit my sister in Bath, after everything. I haven't decided yet." Her words were quick, and Miss Marple noted the hesitation, as if the explanation had been rehearsed but not perfected. She thought of Mrs. Clement, who had packed a bag in haste after a scandal, only to return when the truth emerged. A suitcase, Miss Marple knew, could mean escapade preparation. They spoke for a few minutes more. Miss Marple steering the conversation to the village's autumn fete and the vicar's latest sermon, her manner disarming. But her eyes missed nothing: the untouched dinner plates on a sideboard, the faint scent of lavender that clung to Eleanor, the way her fingers brushed a locket at her throat when Cedric's name was mentioned. As Miss Marple rose to leave, she paused at the door, her smile warm. "You've been very kind to indulge an old woman's visit, Mrs. Hawthorne. I do hope you'll find some comfort in the days ahead." Eleanor managed a tight smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's good to know the village cares." But her eyes were distant, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy. Grief, she knew, was a heavy burden, but so was secrecy, as she walked back to her cottage, the village now bathed in the soft glow of late morning. Miss Marple's mind turned over the encounter. Eleanor's silence was not just grief. It was a wall, carefully constructed to keep something hidden. The suitcase, the damp coat, the locket, these were fragments of a story yet to be told. She thought of the studio, its locked doors and blood-stained table, and wondered if Eleanor's headache had kept her home or sent her out into the storm. Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Bantry's tale of Eleanor crying at the church gate, and the whispers of Cedric's interests elsewhere. Betrayal, she mused, could cut both ways, and a wife's silence could be as dangerous as a shout. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resumed. She wrote a note to Inspector Craddock, suggesting he check the Hawthorne garden for signs of recent disturbance, perhaps footprints, or traces of that lavender scent. Eleanor's story, like Tom's, held together but frayed at the edges, and Miss Marple knew that truth often lay in the seams. As the fire crackled, she tied off a stitch, her thoughts weaving a pattern that grew clearer with each quiet moment. The widow's silence, she suspected, would speak volumes before the case was done. Chapter 6. The client's complaint. The late afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of amber and gold, as if to soften the shadow cast by Cedric Hawthorne's murder. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting tucked into her basket, made her way to the village hall, where the annual flower show was in full swing. The hall was a riot of color, with dahlias and roses vying for attention, and the air hummed with the chatter of villagers eager to escape the grim whispers of the past week. Miss Marple, however, had come not for the blooms, but for the opportunity to observe Mr. Arthur Grayson, the wealthy landowner whose grand manor project had been at the heart of Cedric's final days. His booming complaints about delays, she had heard, were as much a part of the village's gossip as the murder itself. She found a spot near a display of chrysanthemums, her modest hat blending with the crowd, and settled onto a folding chair with her knitting in hand. From here, she could see the entire hall, its wooden beams festooned with bunting, and its tables laden with flowers and homemade jams. Mr. Grayson was impossible to miss, his broad frame dominating a corner where he held court with a group of farmers and local gentry. His silver hair gleamed under the lights, and his mahogany cane, tipped with a silver lion's head, punctuated his words with sharp taps on the floor. "Hawthorne was bleeding me dry," he declared, his voice carrying over the hum of conversation. "Delays, revisions, endless demands for more funds unconscionable." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes fixed on Grayson as she listened. His words were laced with indignation, but there was a theatrical quality to them, as if he enjoyed the attention his complaints drew. She thought of Colonel Hargreaves, a retired officer from her youth, whose bluster had masked a calculating mind. Grayson's anger, she suspected, was not just about money but about control, and a man like him did not take kindly to being thwarted. She noted the cane again, its weight suggesting more than mere support. A weapon, perhaps. She wondered, though. The murder had been by bullet, not bludgeon. As the crowd thinned, Miss Marple made her way toward Grayson, pausing to admire a display of roses to avoid seeming too purposeful. She caught his eye and offered a polite smile. "Mr. Grayson, how delightful to see you here. Your roses are quite splendid. I hear. Her voice was warm, disarming, as if she were merely a village spinster with a fondness for flowers. Grayson's scowl softened slightly, though his eyes remained wary. Miss Marple, is it? Yes. My gardeners do well enough, though I'd rather talk roses than architects, if you'll forgive me. He leaned on his cane, his posture imposing but his tone civil, as if mindful of village etiquette. Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. Poor Mr. Hawthorne's passing must be such a blow to your plans. I understand the manor was to be quite grand. She adjusted her spectacles, her gaze gentle but piercing, like sunlight through a magnifying glass. Grayson snorted, his cane tapping the floor. Grand, yes, but a damned nuisance. Hawthorne was a perfectionist. Every detail had to be just so, no matter the cost. I told him last month I'd sue if he didn't finish on time. The man was costing me a fortune. His voice rose, drawing glances from nearby villagers, and Miss Marple noted the flush in his cheeks. Anger, she knew, could be a mask for deeper motives, just as it had been for Mr. Ellison, a local merchant who had threatened a rival only to cover his own debts. It must have been trying, she said, her tone sympathetic. All those delays, and with such an important project. Did you see him often at the studio to discuss progress? Her question was casual, but she watched his reaction closely, noting the slight tightening of his grip on the cane. I went there now and then, Grayson said, his voice gruff. Last time was a week ago, maybe. He was buried in his blueprints, as usual, arguing with that contractor, Burroughs, about some beams. I told him to sort it out, or I'd find someone else. He didn't like that. He chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. But I was at home the night he died, dining with my steward. Ask anyone on my staff, they'll tell you. Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing as she considered his words. His alibi was solid, backed by servants who likely depended on his favor. But she recalled Mrs. Price's mention of Grayson's temper and his threat to sue. A man of his stature, she thought, might see murder as a swifter solution than a courtroom, especially if his pride was at stake. She thought of Mr. Jenkins, the grocer, whose threats against a competitor had been a prelude to sabotage. It's a comfort to know you were well looked after that evening, she said, her voice mild, though I imagine the manor's troubles weighed on you. Grayson's eyes narrowed, as if sensing a trap, but he nodded. They did. But I'm a practical man, Miss Marple. I don't dwell on setbacks. Fix them. He tapped his cane again, a sharp, decisive sound, and excused himself to speak with a judge about the flower show's prizes. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind turning over his words. Practicality, she knew, could be a cold virtue, and cane, with its heavy silver head, lingered in her thoughts as the flower show wound down. Miss Marple slipped out into the evening, the air cool and scented with wood smoke. She decided to stop by the Blue Boar Inn, where the barmaid Lily was a fount of village talk. Over a glass of lemonade, Miss Marple learned that Grayson had indeed been seen at his estate the night of the murder, but Lily added a tidbit that piqued her interest. His steward, Mr. Collins, was at the inn a few days ago, Miss Marple, and he let slip that Mr. Grayson was in a right state about the manor. Said he'd do whatever it took to get it done. Sounded like more than just a lawsuit to me. Miss Marple thanked Lily and walked home, her umbrella tapping the cobblestones. Grayson's wealth and influence made him a formidable figure, but his temper and his cane suggested a man who acted decisively, perhaps ruthlessly. She thought of the studio's locked doors, the revolver, and the muddy path at the back. Grayson's alibi was strong, but servants could be persuaded, and a man of his means might have resources beyond a cane. As she reached her cottage, the stars beginning to prick the sky, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed. Grayson's complaints, she mused, were loud, but his motives might be quieter and far more dangerous. She tied off a stitch, her thoughts weaving toward the next thread in the pattern of Cedric's death. Chapter 7. The contractor's craft. The morning mist had burned away, leaving St. Mary Mead bathed in a crisp autumn light that turned the village's thatched roofs into a patchwork of gold and russet. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting a soft rhythm against the chirping of sparrows. The murder of Cedric Hawthorne remained the pulse of village talk, and today her thoughts were fixed on Harold Burroughs, the contractor whose jovial demeanor at the studio had seemed, to her sharp eye, a touch too polished. Mrs. Price's gossip about his alleged corner-cutting and the heated row with Cedric in the village square had planted a seed of suspicion, and Miss Marple was not one to let such seeds lie fallow. She decided to invite Mr. Burroughs for tea, a pretext as old as the village itself, but one that never failed to loosen tongues. A note was sent via the postmistress's boy, and by 3 o'clock, Burroughs arrived at her cottage, his burly frame filling the doorway. His face, ruddy and creased with a broad smile, was the picture of affability. But Miss Marple noted the slight sheen of sweat on his brow, despite the cool day. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure," he boomed, removing his cap and wiping his hands on his trousers. "Heard you're a bit of a sleuth, eh? Helping the police with poor Cedric's case?" "Oh, hardly that," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "I'm just an old woman who likes to chat over tea. Do come in, Mr. Burroughs." She led him to the parlor, where a tray of tea and scones awaited, the fire casting a warm glow over the chintz and lace. Burroughs settled into a chair, his bulk making it creak, and accepted a cup with a nod of thanks. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she studied him, noting the calluses on his hands and the faint smudge of mortar dust on his cuff. A man who worked hard, or wished to appear so. "It's a dreadful business about Mr. Hawthorne," she began, pouring tea with a steady hand. "Such a talented man, and so much at stake with that manor project. You must have worked closely with him." Her tone was warm, inviting confidence, but her eyes were keen, missing nothing. Burroughs nodded, his smile unwavering. "Aye, Cedric was a genius, no doubt. A bit particular, mind you, but that's what made him great. We were building something special with that manor, Mr. Grayson's dream, you might say." He took a sip of tea, his eyes darting briefly to the window, as if checking for eavesdroppers. Miss Marple thought of Mr. Hoskins, the butcher, whose hearty manner had hidden a ledger full of debts. Burroughs's cheer, she suspected, was similarly constructed. "It must be challenging," she said, her voice sympathetic, "working with someone so exacting. I heard there were disagreements about the construction, something about the materials." She let the question hang, her needles pausing for a moment as she watched his reaction. Burroughs's smile faltered, just for an instant, before he recovered. "Oh, you've heard the village talk, have you? Well, Cedric was a stickler for quality, I'll give him that. He questioned some of the timber we used for the manor's beams, but it was all above board, I assure you. Just a misunderstanding." His voice was smooth, but his hands clenched briefly around his teacup, the knuckles whitening. Miss Marple noted the gesture, recalling Mr. Jenkins, the grocer, whose hands had betrayed his nerves when questioned about smuggled goods. "Misunderstandings can be so troublesome," she said, her tone light, "especially in a project as grand as Mr. Grayson's manor. I imagine it put quite a strain on everyone." She offered a scone, her smile encouraging, but her eyes lingered on his face. Searching for the cracks in his composure, Burroughs took the scone, his fingers leaving a faint trace of crumbs. "It did, Miss Marple. Construction's a tough game. Deadlines, budgets, clients breathing down your neck. Cedric wanted perfection, but perfection costs money, and Mr. Grayson wasn't always keen to pay. We had our spats, sure, but nothing serious. I was at the Blue Boar the night it happened, as I told the inspector. Half the village saw me there." He chuckled, a sound meant to disarm, but Miss Marple caught the slight strain in it, like a note played off-key. "Of course," she said, nodding. "It's a comfort to know you were among friends that evening, though I suppose you must have visited the studio often to discuss the work." Her question was casual, but she watched his eyes, noting the way they flicked to the side, as if chasing a thought he wished to avoid. "Now and then," he said, his voice a shade too hearty. "Cedric liked to keep an eye on things, you know. I'd drop by with samples or plans, but I wasn't there that night. Too busy with a pint and good company." He leaned back, his smile widening, but Miss Marple saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers brushed the rim of his cap on the table. She thought of Mr. Ellison, the builder, whose joviality had crumbled under the weight of exposed negligence. Burroughs, she suspected, was treading a similar path as they spoke. Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the small details of his appearance. His boots, though polished, bore traces of mud, not the red clay of the village square, but the darker loam of the fields near the studio. His coat, slung over the chair, had a torn pocket, as if caught on something sharp. A nail, perhaps, or a splinter from the lumber pile by the studio's back door. She filed these observations away, her mind turning to the blueprint Craddock had shown her, with Cedric's note about substandard timber and Boros's name. If Cedric had threatened to expose faulty work, it could ruin a contractor's reputation and his livelihood. "You must take great pride in your work," she said, offering more tea. "It's no small thing, building a manor that will stand for generations. Though, I suppose it's easy to make mistakes, with so many details to manage." Her tone was kind, but her words were a gentle probe, testing the edges of his confidence. Burroughs's smile tightened, and he set his cup down with a faint clink. "Mistakes? Oh, I'm careful, Miss Marple. Been in the trade 20 years, and I know my craft. Cedric's standards were high, but I met them. Anyone who says otherwise is mistaken." His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed him, lingering on the fire, as if it held answers he didn't wish to share. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her thoughts weaving a pattern around his unease. Guilt, she knew, had a way of seeping through even the most practiced facade. They spoke for a few minutes more, Miss Marple steering the conversation. To the village's harvest festival and the weather, her manner as disarming as ever. But her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of Burroughs's story. His alibi at the Blue Boar was strong, backed by witnesses, but the mud on his boots and the torn pocket suggested a visit to the studio that he hadn't mentioned. She thought of the back path, muddy from the storm, and the lumber pile that could snag a coat. Burroughs's craft, she suspected, extended beyond construction to the art of concealment. As he rose to leave, thanking her for the tea, Miss Marple smiled warmly. "It's been a pleasure, Mr. Burroughs. You've been most kind to indulge an old woman's curiosity. I do hope the manor project will go smoothly now, despite this tragedy." He nodded, his smile back in place, but Miss Marple saw the flicker of relief in his eyes, as if he'd escaped the trap. She closed the door behind him, her thoughts already turning to Inspector Craddock. That evening, she penned a note to the inspector, suggesting he check the lumber pile by the studio's back door for traces of fabric or other signs of passage. She also mentioned the mud on Burroughs's boots, a detail that might align with the field's soil. As she sealed the envelope, her knitting lay idle, her mind weaving the threads of the case. Burroughs's joviality, like Eleanor's silence and Tom's nerves, was a mask, and behind it lay a motive tied to the manor's faulty beams. She thought of Mr. Hoskins again, whose smile had hidden ruin, and wondered if Burroughs's craft had led him to a desperate act. As the stars rose over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple tied off a stitch, her thoughts sharpening on the truth that lay just beyond her reach. Chapter 8. The clue in the drafts. The morning was sharp and clear in St. Mary Mead, the kind of autumn day that made the village seem a painting, with its golden leaves and chimneys trailing wisps of smoke. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting tucked into her basket, set out for Cedric Hawthorne's studio. Her mind is focused as the sunlight piercing the hedge. The threads of the case, Selenor's guarded silence, Tom's restless ambition, Grayson's blustering temper, and Burroughs's forced joviality were beginning to form a pattern. But it was incomplete, like a shawl missing its final stitches. The studio, she felt, held the key. Its silent walls witnessed to the truth of Cedric's final moments. Inspector Craddock had agreed to let her visit again, his trust in her instincts outweighing his professional skepticism, and she arrived to find him already there, poring over a stack of blueprints with a furrowed brow. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, looking up from the drafting table. The bloodstains had been scrubbed away, but the table bore faint scratches, as if Cedric's fingers had clawed at it in his last struggle. "I've been going through these plans again. There's something here, I'm sure of it, but I can't quite put my finger on it." His voice carried the weariness of a man wrestling with details that refused to align. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "Sometimes, Inspector, it's the smallest detail that speaks the loudest. May I look?" She approached the table, her steps light but purposeful, and surveyed the array of blueprints. They were meticulous, Cedric's hand evident in the precise lines and annotations, each a testament to his unrelenting vision. But one drawing, tucked beneath a larger plan of Grayson's manor, caught her eye. It was smaller, almost an afterthought, with a corner folded as if hastily hidden. She lifted it carefully, her fingers brushing the paper's edge. The blueprint was a detailed section of the manor's foundation, its beams and supports drawn with obsessive care. In the margin, in Cedric's spidery script, was a note: "Burroughs faulty. Beams must report." The words were underlined twice, the ink heavier, as if pressed with urgency. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind racing. Faulty beams could mean structural failure, a scandal that would ruin a contractor's reputation and endanger lives. She thought of Mr. Ellison, the builder from her youth, whose shortcuts had led to a collapsed barn and a village uproar. Burroughs, she suspected, had more to lose than she'd realized. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but firm. "This note suggests Mr. Hawthorne was about to take action against Mr. Burroughs. If the beams were indeed substandard, it could explain a great deal." She handed him the blueprint, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. Craddock's brow lifted as he read the note. "This is something," he said, his voice quickening. "We found samples of timber at the manor site yesterday. Some of it was subpar, just as Hawthorne suspected. If he was planning to report Burroughs, it's a motive, clear as day." He paused, rubbing his chin. "But Burroughs has that alibi. Have the Blue Boar swears he was there till closing." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she took a seat in the corner, her knitting a pretext for observation. "Alibis, Inspector, are like lace, beautiful until you hold them to the light. Mr. Burroughs's cheer is convincing, but his boots told a different story. And that torn pocket, did you find anything in the lumber pile by the back door?" She kept her tone mild, but her question was a gentle nudge. Guiding Craddock toward the details she'd noted, he frowned, flipping through his notebook. "We did find a scrap of fabric caught on a nail in the lumber. Dark wool, like a coat. Could be Burroughs's, though we haven't matched it yet. And the soil near the back path, Constable Reed says it's the same dark loam we found on Burroughs's boots." He looked at her, a mix of admiration and exasperation in his eyes. "You've been busy, Miss Marple." "Oh? Just noticing things," she said, her smile disarming. "People are careless, you know, when they're in a hurry, and fear makes them careless still." She turned her attention to the studio, her gaze sweeping the room. The walls were still lined with Cedric's designs, their elegance a stark contrast to the violence that had ended his life. A small desk in the corner held the sketchbook she'd noticed before, its pages filled with Cedric's quick, expressive drawings. She rose, her movements unhurried, and opened it, flipping through sketches of arches, spires, and, curiously, a portrait of Eleanor, her face drawn with a tenderness that belied the rumors of betrayal. "This sketchbook," she said, holding it up. "Did you examine it closely, Inspector? It's more than just designs, I think." Craddock joined her, peering at the pages. One sketch, near the back, showed a rough outline of the manor's foundation, with a red pencil circling the beams. And a single word: fraud. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Cedric was thorough," she murmured. "He wasn't just suspicious, he was gathering evidence." Craddock nodded, his expression grim. "If Burroughs knew Hawthorne was onto him, it's more than a motive, I'd say death sentence. But we need more than notes and fabric to pin it on him. The revolver's still a puzzle, no fingerprints, and none of the suspects admit to owning one." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This case is like trying to nail jelly to a wall." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning to the revolver, a Webley Standard issue, with no serial number, a weapon meant to be untraceable, yet left at the scene. She thought of Mrs. Carter, a widow from her youth, who had kept her husband's old service revolver hidden in a drawer, a relic of war that became a tool of vengeance. "Weapons," she said softly, "have a way of turning up in unexpected hands. Have you checked the manor site itself? Construction sites are full of hiding places." Craddock's eyes lit up. "That's a thought. We focused on the studio, but the manor's just a mile away. I'll have Red search the sheds and toolboxes there." He jotted a note, then looked at her with a wry smile. "You're a step ahead, as usual, Miss Marple." She smiled, folding the blueprint carefully. "I'm just an old woman who sees patterns, Inspector, and this note, this clue in the draft, tells us Cedric was a man who saw patterns too. Patterns of deceit, perhaps." She thought of Burroughs's sweating brow, his torn pocket, and the mud that linked him to the studio's back path. The pieces were falling into place, but the pattern was not yet complete. She handed the blueprint to Craddock, her mind already weaving the next steps. As she left the studio, the air was cooler, the sun dipping behind the hills. Miss Marple walked slowly, her umbrella tapping the ground, her thoughts on Burroughs. His craft, she suspected, was not just in building, but in covering his tracks. Yet he'd left traces, as all guilty men do. She thought of Mr. Hoskins, whose ledger had betrayed him, and wondered what other secrets Burroughs's work might reveal. At her cottage, she penned a note to Craddock, suggesting he question the Blue Boar's patrons about the exact timing of Burroughs's presence. Alibis, she knew, could bend under scrutiny. As the stars rose over St. Mary Mead, she tied off a stitch, her mind sharp with the certainty that the clue in the drafts was the thread that would unravel the truth. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The evening sky over St. Mary Mead was a tapestry of deepening blues, pricked with the first faint stars, as Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm. The fire cast a warm glow across the room, but her mind was far from the cozy confines of her cottage. The clue in Cedric Hawthorne's drafts, the note about Burroughs's faulty beams, had sharpened the pattern of the case, and Miss Marple felt the threads of motive and opportunity drawing tighter. Harold Burroughs, with his jovial mask and muddy boots, stood at the center of her thoughts, but suspicion alone was not enough. Proof, she knew, required a nudge, a carefully laid trap, to coax the truth from the shadows. She had suggested such a trap to Inspector Craddock, and now, as the village clock struck 7, she prepared to witness its unfolding. The plan was simple, yet bold, in the way of all good traps. Craddock, at Miss Marple's gentle urging, had announced a meeting at the studio, claiming that a new witness had come forward with critical evidence about the night of Cedric's murder. The announcement had been made discreetly, through Mrs. Bantry's network of village gossips, ensuring that Eleanor Hawthorne, Tom Eldridge, Arthur Grayson, and Harold Burroughs would all hear of it. The meeting was set for 8 o'clock, under the pretense of revealing this witness's testimony, though no such witness existed. Miss Marple knew that guilt, like a startled bird, could be flushed from cover by the right disturbance. She arrived at the studio a few minutes early, her black umbrella tucked under her arm, her hat pinned neatly against the evening breeze. The barn loomed dark against the twilight, its windows reflecting the last glimmers of daylight. Inside, the air was cool, carrying the faint scent of ink and wood, and the drafting table stood as a silent reminder of the crime. Craddock was already there, arranging chairs in a loose circle, his face set with the determination of a man who trusted his plan but not its outcome. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his voice low, "I hope this works. If Burroughs is our man, he might crack under pressure, but I'm not counting on it." Miss Marple smiled, settling into a corner chair with her knitting. "People, Inspector, are rarely as composed as they seem when their secrets are at stake. We shall see who flinches." Her needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm that belied the sharpness of her gaze. She positioned herself to observe the entire room, her presence unobtrusive yet all-seeing. Like a spider in the web of human nature, the suspects arrived one by one, each carrying an air of unease that thickened the atmosphere. Eleanor entered first, her gray silk dress impeccable, but her face pale, her hands clasped tightly as she took a seat near the window. Her eyes avoided the drafting table, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her fingers, as if the weight of the moment pressed harder than her composure could bear. Tom followed, his sandy hair disheveled, his fingers fidgeting with a pencil. Stub that seemed a permanent extension of his hand. He glanced at the blueprints on the wall, his expression a mix of nerves and defiance, reminding Miss Marple of a schoolboy caught out of bounds. Arthur Grayson strode in next, his broad frame filling the doorway, his cane tapping an impatient rhythm on the floor. "This had better be quick, Craddock," he growled, his silver hair catching the lamplight. "I've no time for theatrics." He sat heavily, his cane resting across his knees, its silver head gleaming like a warning. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the way his eyes darted to the others, as if assessing rivals rather than allies. Finally, Harold Burroughs arrived, his smile as broad as ever, but his eyes wary, like a man stepping onto thin ice. "Evening, Inspector, Miss Marple," he said, his voice booming. "Heard you've got a witness. Hope it clears things up." His cheer was convincing, but Miss Marple saw the sweat beading on his brow, the way his hands brushed his coat as if to smooth away evidence. Craddock stood at the center of the circle, his notebook in hand, his expression grave. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady. "As you know, we've been investigating Mr. Hawthorne's murder, and new evidence has come to light. A witness claims to have seen someone at the studio that night, near the back path, around the time of the shooting." He paused, letting the words settle, and Miss Marple's eyes moved from face to face, catching the subtle shifts in demeanor. Eleanor's lips parted, her breath catching, though she quickly masked it with a cough. Tom's pencil snapped in his hand, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and he muttered an apology, his cheeks flushing. Grayson's cane tapped once, a single, deliberate strike, his scowl deepening as he muttered, "Waste of time." Burroughs, however, reacted most visibly. His smile froze, and his hands clenched, the knuckles whitening against his trousers. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind noting the panic that flickered in his eyes. Like a candle caught in a draft, Craddock continued, his tone measured but pointed. "This witness also mentioned something about the manor projects, specifically concerns about the construction. We found a note in Mr. Hawthorne's drafts, accusing Mr. Burroughs of using faulty beams. If he was planning to report this, it could have ruined someone's reputation." He held up the blueprint with Cedric's scrawled note, his eyes locking on Burroughs. "Care to comment, Mr. Burroughs?" The contractor's face reddened, his smile collapsing into a grimace. "That's nonsense," he burst out, standing abruptly. Cedric was always nitpicking, but my work was solid. I told you, I was at the Blue Boar that night to ask anyone. His voice was loud, but it cracked at the edges, and Miss Marple saw the sweat now trickling down his temple. She thought of Mr. Hoskins, the butcher, whose bluster had crumbled when his ledger was exposed, and knew that Burroughs was teetering on the edge of confession. Eleanor's eyes widened, her hands twisting in her lap, but she said nothing, her silence as telling as Burroughs's outburst. Tom shifted in his seat, his broken pencil rolling to the floor, his gaze fixed on the ground. Grayson snorted, his cane tapping a slow rhythm, as if impatient for the drama to end. Craddock pressed on, his voice calm but relentless. We also found a scrap of fabric in the lumber pile by the back door, and soil matching the fields. Loam, someone was there, Mr. Burroughs, and your boots tell a story you haven't. Burroughs's face drained of color, and he took a step back, his hands raised as if to ward off the accusation. I wasn't there. I'm not feeling well, Inspector. Can we do this another time? He turned toward the door, his movements jerky, and Miss Marple's needles stilled completely. Panic, she thought, was the first confession, and Burroughs's was written in every line of his body. Craddock stepped forward, his voice firm. Sit down, Mr. Burroughs. We're not done. But the contractor's eyes darted to the back door, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought he might bolt. Instead, he sank back into his chair, his smile gone, his hands trembling. The room was silent, save for the faint creak of the barn's beams and the distant call of an owl. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the other Eleanor's rigid posture. Tom's flushed face, Grayson's impatient scowl, but it was Burroughs who held her attention. The trap had been sprung, and the truth was stirring as the meeting ended. Craddock dismissed the group, his eyes lingering on Burroughs. Miss Marple remained, her knitting resumed, her thoughts sharp. Well played, Inspector, she said softly. Mr. Burroughs is rattled, and a rattled man makes mistakes. Craddock nodded, his expression grim. We're close, Miss Marple, but we need more. I'll have retail him tonight. She smiled, tying off a stitch. The trap, she knew, had not yet closed, but the threads of guilt were tightening, and Burroughs's craft was unraveling before her eyes. Chapter 10. The contractor's confession. The night had settled over St. Mary Mead like a velvet curtain, the village's lamplights flickering against the darkness as Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, her knitting idle for once. The trap set at the studio had done its work, stirring the guilty heart of Harold Burroughs, and she sensed the case was nearing its climax. Inspector Craddock had acted swiftly after the meeting, dispatching Constable Reed to keep a discreet watch on Burroughs, whose panic had been as clear as a bell to Miss Marple's keen eye. The contractor's bluster, his sweating brow, his hasty retreatal pointed to a man whose secrets were unraveling. Now, as the clock ticked toward 10, she awaited Craddock's report, her mind weaving the final threads of Cedric Hawthorne's murder. A knock at the door broke her reverie, and Craddock entered, his face a mix of triumph and exhaustion. Miss Marple, he said, removing his hat, we've got him. Burroughs broke, just as you thought he would. He sank into a chair, accepting the tea she offered, with a grateful nod. Your trap worked better than I expected. He's at the station now, and he's confessed. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. Do tell me, Inspector, what happened? Her voice was soft, encouraging, as she settled back, her hands folded in her lap. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced across the chintz, and Craddock leaned forward, his notebook open but unneeded. After the meeting, Burroughs was a wreck, he began. Reed followed him to the Blue Boar, where he downed 3 pints in quick succession. He was muttering to himself, looking over his shoulder like a hunted man. Reed overheard him say something about the beams, and Cedric knowing too much. That's when we brought him in for questioning. I showed him the blueprint with Cedric's note. Burroughs' faulty beams, must report, and the scrap of fabric from the lumber pile. Matched his coat perfectly, by the way. Then I told him we'd found traces of his boot polish on the studio floor, near the back door. That was the clincher. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts returning to the muddy boots and torn pockets she'd noticed during her tea with Burroughs. And what did he say, Inspector? Her tone was gentle, but her mind was sharp, piecing together the final pattern. Craddock sighed, rubbing his temple. He cracked like an egg. Said he went to the studio that night to reason with Cedric. He'd been using cheaper timber for the manor's beams to cut costs. Thought he could get away with it, as the foundation was mostly hidden. But Cedric, being the perfectionist he was, noticed the difference during an inspection. He was furious, threatened to report Burroughs to the authorities and Grayson. It would have ruined Burroughs's business, maybe landed him in court for fraud. Burroughs swore he only meant to scare Cedric, brought the revolver to intimidate him, but things got heated, and the gun went off. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. Poor man, she murmured, not for Burroughs, but for Cedric, whose pursuit of excellence had cost him his life. She thought of Mr. Ellison, the builder whose shortcuts had led to ruin, and saw the parallel in Burroughs's greed. And the revolver, she asked, where did it come from? Burroughs admitted it was his, Craddock said. An old Webley he kept from his army days unregistered. He hid it in a toolbox at the manor site after the shooting, thinking it wouldn't be found. We searched the site this morning, based on your suggestion, and there it was, wrapped in oilcloth. No fingerprints he'd wiped it clean, but his confession ties it up. He shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. You were right about the construction site, Miss Marple. You've got a knack for this. She smiled, her eyes twinkling. I only notice what people leave behind, Inspector. A torn coat, a muddy boot, a note in a draft. These are the footprints of the heart. She paused, her thoughts turning to the other suspects. And the others. Mrs. Hawthorne, Mr. Eldridge, Mr. Grayson. Were they cleared? Craddock nodded. Eleanor's alibi held, though she was hiding something of private grief, maybe. We found no evidence she was at the studio that night, and her damp coat was from a walk in the rain, confirmed by a neighbor. Tom was nervous, because he'd been sneaking his own designs to a London firm, afraid Cedric would find out and fire him. His muddy shoes were from a shortcut through the fields, but he was at the bakery by 8, as Mrs. Tuttle said. Grayson's temper was all bluster. His steward and staff confirmed he was at home, and he had no real reason to kill Cedric, just to sue him. Burroughs was the only one with everything to lose. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, though her knitting lay untouched. Greed, she said softly, is a powerful force. Mr. Burroughs built his life on appearances, but appearances crumble when the foundation is weak. She thought of the manor, its grand design marred by shoddy beams, and saw a metaphor for Burroughs's own deception. Did he say anything else, Inspector? About Cedric? Perhaps Craddock flipped through his notebook. He said Cedric was relentless, wouldn't let the issue drop. Burroughs begged him to keep quiet, offered to replace the beams at his own cost, but Cedric was set on exposing him, said it was a matter of principle. Burroughs claimed it was an accident, but the way he described it, grabbing the gun in a panic, the struggle, it sounded like fear turned to rage. He closed the notebook, his expression somber. He's in custody now, and we'll charge him tomorrow. The case is closed, thanks to you. Miss Marple shook her head, her smile tinged with humility. Not me, Inspector. The truth was there, in the drafts in the mud. I only helped it come to light. She rose to pour more tea, her movements graceful, despite her age. As Craddock sipped, she thought of the studio, its silent blueprints now free of their maker's blood. Burroughs's confession had tied the threads, but she felt no triumph. Only a quiet sorrow for the waste of it all: Cedric's life, Burroughs's future. The manor's tarnished dream, as Craddock left, promising to keep her updated. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed. The village was quiet now, the storm of the murder passing like the rain that had heralded it. But she knew St. Mary Mead would never be quite the same, its peace fragile, its secrets always waiting to stir. She tied off a stitch, her thoughts settling like dust after a storm. The contractor's confession had closed the case, but the human heart, she knew, would always hold more mysteries than any trap could catch. Chapter 11. The threads unraveled. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the mist to touch the village with a tender glow. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, a pot of tea steaming beside her, her knitting, a quiet companion as she reflected on the resolution of Cedric Hawthorne's murder. Harold Boros's confession had brought the case to a close, yet the village buzzed with a restless energy, as if the truth had stirred more questions than it answered. Miss Marple, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm, felt the weight of the human stories behind the crime, grief, ambition, pride, and greed, all woven into the fabric of a single fatal moment. Inspector Craddock had promised to visit that afternoon to tie up loose ends, and she looked forward to his account with her usual quiet curiosity. By 2 o'clock, Craddock arrived, his face less strained than it had been in days, though his eyes still carried the shadow of a man who had seen too much of human folly. "Miss Marple," he greeted, settling into her parlor with a sigh. "It's done. Burroughs is charged, and the evidence is solid. His confession, the revolver, the fabric, the mud. The magistrate will hear it tomorrow." He accepted a cup of tea, his gratitude evident in the way he relaxed into the chintz armchair. "I owe you a great deal. That trap at the studio was the key." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Nonsense, Inspector. You did the hard work. I only pointed out a few threads that needed pulling." Her voice was gentle, but her mind was already sifting through the case, ensuring no detail had been overlooked. "Tell me, how did the others take the news? Mrs. Hawthorne, Mr. Eldridge, Mr. Grayson, they must have been relieved, in their way." Craddock nodded, sipping his tea. "Relieved, yes, but each in their own fashion. I spoke to them this morning, to close out their statements. Eleanor was quiet, more composed than I expected, but there's a sadness in her that goes beyond Cedric's death. I think she's been carrying something for a long time." He paused, flipping open his notebook. "We looked into her movements that night, as you suggested. A neighbor confirmed seeing her in the garden, pacing in the rain, but she never left the property. Her talk of betrayal seems to have been about Cedric's flirtations, nothing criminal, just a private wound." Miss Marple's needles paused, her thoughts on Eleanor's brittle poise and the half-packed suitcase. "Poor woman," she murmured. "Love can be a heavy burden when it's tangled with mistrust." She recalled Mrs. Hargreaves, whose husband's affairs had left her silent but resolute, and saw a similar strength in Eleanor. "She'll find her way, I think, but it will take time," Craddock continued, turning a page. Tom Eldridge was shaken, but not surprised. He admitted he'd been afraid we'd suspect him, what with his muddy shoes and his sneaking designs to London. Turns out he was working on his own project that night, sketching in his room above the bakery. Mrs. Tuttle vouched for the time, and we found his sketches nothing to do with Cedric's work, just his own dreams of a future in the city. He's young, ambitious, but not a killer. Miss Marple nodded, her mind easing on Tom. His broken pencil and nervous glances had been the product of a young man's fear of being overshadowed, not of guilt. She thought of young Mr. Carter, whose ambition had led to petty sabotage, but never violence. "Ambition," she said softly, "can make a man reckless, but not always dangerous. Tom will learn that, I hope." "As for Grayson," Craddock said, a wry smile tugging at his lips, "he's as blustery as ever. Complained about the inconvenience, of course, but he's already talking about hiring a new architect to finish the manor. His alibi was airtight, his Steward and half a dozen servants placed him at his estate all evening. His threats to sue Cedric were just that, threats. He's a man who likes to make noise, but he'd rather fight in a courtroom than a studio. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly, her thoughts on Grayson's heavy cane and louder temper. Men like Mr. Grayson, she said, are often more bark than bite. But it's good to know his bark was all we had to fear. She thought of Colonel Hargreaves, whose bluster had hidden only pride, and felt satisfied that Grayson's role was no darker. Craddock leaned back, his tea cooling. It all comes back to Burroughs. His greed got the better of him, cutting corners on the beams to save a few pounds, thinking Cedric wouldn't notice. When Cedric did, and threatened to expose him, Burroughs panicked. He swears it was an accident, but the revolver in his hand says otherwise. He shook his head, his voice tinged with disgust. He's ruined himself, and for what? A few shillings saved on timber. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her expression remained composed. Greed, Inspector, is a quiet poison. It creeps into the heart and builds a cage of fear. Mr. Burroughs thought he could outrun it, but Cedric's principles were his undoing. She thought of Mr. Hoskins, the butcher, whose ledger had betrayed his greed, and saw the parallel in Burroughs's downfall. People, she added, her voice barely above a whisper, will do terrible things to protect their secrets. Craddock nodded, closing his notebook. You've a way of seeing people, Miss Marple. I'd have missed half these clues without you. The mud, the fabric, that note in the drafts. You've got a sharper eye than most of my constables. He rose, adjusting his hat. I'll let you know how the hearing goes. For now, St. Mary Mead can sleep a bit easier. Miss Marple saw him to the door, her smile warm but tinged with sadness. Thank you, Inspector. But peace, I'm afraid, is always fleeting in a village like ours. As he left, she returned to her knitting, the needles resuming their rhythm. The threads of the case were unraveled now, each suspect's story laid. Eleanor's private grief, Tom's thwarted dreams, Grayson's empty threats, and Burroughs's fatal greed. Yet the tapestry of human nature, she knew, would always weave new patterns, new secrets waiting to be uncovered. She tied off a stitch, her thoughts settling like the village itself, quiet but ever watchful. Chapter 12. The quiet of St. Mary Mead. The autumn days in St. Mary Mead had softened into a gentle rhythm, the village settling like a sigh after the storm of Cedric Hawthorne's murder. The sun, low and golden, cast long shadows across the cobblestones, and the air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the distant bleating of sheep in the fields. The scarf she was crafting for the vicar's wife was nearly complete, its neat stitches a mirror to the resolution of the case. Harold Burroughs's confession had closed the chapter on the architect's death, yet Miss Marple knew that the village, like her knitting, held threads that could unravel with the slightest tug. The Manor project, once Cedric's grand vision, had ground to a halt. Its half-built frame, a silent monument to ambition and betrayal. Mr. Grayson, ever the pragmatist, had already engaged a new architect from London. Though his grumbling about costs echoed through the Blue Boar Inn, Miss Marple had heard from Mrs. Bantry, who had called with her usual basket of scones and gossip, that Grayson was determined to salvage the project, if only to prove his own resolve. He's all blustered, Mrs. Bantry had said, but he's got the money to make it happen. Miss Marple had nodded, her needles clicking, and thought of Colonel Hargreaves, whose pride had driven him to finish a folly, despite its flaws. Grayson, she suspected, would build his manor, but its shadow would always carry Cedric's name. Eleanor Hawthorne had left St. Mary Mead for Bath, her half-packed suitcase finally closed. Mrs. Price, ever the purveyor of village news, reported that Eleanor had gone to stay with her sister, seeking solace in the quiet of a new place. She looked like a ghost, Mrs. Price had said, her voice hushed, but she held her head high, as always. Miss Marple had felt a pang of sympathy, recalling Eleanor's brittle poise and the locket she'd touched when speaking of Cedric. Love, she knew, could linger like a bruise, and silence had been its own kind of mourning. She thought of Mrs. Langley, who had rebuilt her life after a broken marriage, and hoped Eleanor would find a similar strength. Tom Eldridge, the young assistant, had taken a bold step, opening a small studio in the village with a loan from a sympathetic uncle. His sketches, once hidden in fear of Cedric's shadow, were now displayed proudly in the bakery's window, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Lily, the barmaid at the Blue Boar, had told Miss Marple that Tom was planning to submit his designs to a county competition, his ambition undimmed by the tragedy. "He's got a spark, that one," Lily had said, polishing a glass. Miss Marple had smiled, thinking of young Mr. Carter, whose dreams had led him to small victories after smaller scenes. Tom, she felt, would find his place though. The road would not be easy. As for Harold Burroughs, the contractor's fate was sealed. The magistrate's hearing, as Craddock had reported, was swift and decisive. Burroughs, his jovial mask gone, had pleaded guilty to manslaughter, claiming the shooting was an accident born of panic. The revolver, the fabric, the muddle had woven a noose of evidence too tight to escape. He was to be sentenced soon, likely 2 years in prison, his reputation as ruined as the beams he'd tried to hide. Miss Marple felt no satisfaction, only a quiet sorrow for the greed that had undone him. She thought of Mr. Hoskins, whose ledger had been his downfall, and saw the universal truth of human frailty. She rose from her chair, setting her knitting aside, and stepped into her garden, where the last roses clung to their stems. The village was peaceful now, its rhythms restored. But Miss Marple knew that peace was a fragile thing, like the laced curtains in her parlor. Secrets lingered in St. Mary Mead, hidden in the glances of neighbors, the silences of homes, the shadows of hedgerows. She adjusted her hat, her eyes scanning the familiar lanes, and thought of the studio. Its blueprints now silent, its story told. Cedric's death had been a storm, but the village had weathered it, as it always did. As she returned to her parlor, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the scarf's final stitches calling her. "Life," she murmured, tying off a thread, "is never quite as tidy as a finished scarf." The fire crackled, the clock ticked, and St. Mary Mead lay quiet under the stars. But Miss Marple, her needles moving once more, knew that another storm would come, another pattern to unravel. For now, she sat content, her mind as sharp as ever, ready for the next thread to pull.